Hi, and welcome to Unit 4, Day 8, where we're going to learn a bit about acids. So before we get in, I just want to remind you why we're learning this. In week 1 of Unit 4, we looked at properties of metals, ionic compounds, and covalent molecules. And one of the things that we noted was, if we focus on the covalent molecules, is that we had to know whether something was an acid to determine if it's an insulator or a conductor, and the polarity to determine if it's soluble or insoluble in water. So today we're going to take a deeper dive into what acids are because that's important for our understanding of a covalent molecule. And the main goal of this lesson is to sort of be able to identify if something is an acid from its chemical formula. Along the way, we'll also learn some more information about acids based on questions that people had about them in exit tickets and other things like that. So here's our outline of the presentation. First, we'll start with defining acids. If you want to read what else is happening in the lesson, you can pause the video. All right, let's jump right into defining acids. So what comes to mind when you think of acids? These are images of some things that come to my mind when I think of acids. So starting with being a child of the 80s, I think of acid wash jeans. That's something that comes to mind. I also think of foods that are sour and taste acidic. I oftentimes associate those with acid. And then the resulting heartburn I get when or acid reflux I get when I eat those foods. I also think about, if I think back to my bio days, the nucleic acids that hold together DNA. I think about acid rain, and I think about people who've been attacked by acids and suffered victims of acid attacks. I also often think about when you add a metal like we did in the properties lab and to acid, if you mix a metal and acid, it produces these bubbles. So I think of reaction. And I also oftentimes think of this carboxylic acid. So these are things that come to my mind, and maybe some of these things resonate to you. So what exactly are acids? Acids are covalent molecules that have a pH that's less than 7. And because the pH is less than 7, it turns something like litmus paper, which we did that test in the lab, red. So normally litmus paper is this yellow, orange color, and then if you add it to an acid, it turns red. Something else to know about acids is that when they're dissolved in water, they ionize to produce H+, a cation, and an anion. And because they produce these ions, that's why they conduct in aqueous solution. Other characteristics of acids is that they taste sour, they're corrosive to the skin, so they can burn your skin, and they break down metals. All right, now that we learned what acids are, a little bit about acids, now how do we recognize them from their chemical formulas? So let's take a look at some Lewis dot structures that's helpful for us. We're going to start with, there are like two types that we're going to look at. The first one is binary, and these are acids that are made of two types of atoms. So for example, HCl, hydrochloric acid, which is the same acid you used in the properties of metals and nonmetals lab. And then there's also H2S. So these are an example of binary acids. They're made up of two types of atom. Another example of acids are oxyacids, and these are acids where the hydrogen's attached to an oxygen, typically in a polyatomic ion. So let's take a look at some examples, but before we do, it's important to note that the number of hydrogens in the acid corresponds or is equal to the amount of negative charge in the polyatomic ion. So what do I mean by polyatomic ion? Nitrate is an example of a polyatomic ion. It has a charge and it's poly, meaning more than one atom. So this polyatomic ion has a -1 charge, and in order for you to convert this into an acid, you need to add one hydrogen to this. So this would be the corresponding acid of nitrate. It's called nitrous acid. Nitric acid, sorry. The next example would be sulfate. So sulfate is a polyatomic ion. Notice it has a 2- charge, and the 2- charge tells you that you need how many hydrogens to convert this into an acid. That's right, 2. So the corresponding acid of sulfate ion is sulfuric acid. Another example of polyatomic ion is this CoO or carboxylic acid, and here would be acetate, which is our polyatomic ion, and notice it has a -1 charge. So in order to convert it to an acid, we need 1 hydrogen. All right, so how do we recognize acids from its chemical formula? The thing to remember is this rule: H in the front, CoO in the back. So if you see a hydrogen in the front or a CoO in the back of the chemical formula, it's an acid. The only exception is water, which is neutral. And when we say CoO, we're speaking specifically of that carboxylic acid group that you saw previously. The reason why it's called CoO is because it's made up of 1 carbon, as you see in the structure over here, 2 oxygens, and a hydrogen. And the CoO group can be written as COOH or CO2H. So you have to recognize both. Let's look at some examples of chemical formulas so we can see how we can recognize acids. So here are examples of acids where the hydrogen's in the front. You notice in all of these chemical formulas, there's a hydrogen in the front. And an example, this is vinegar, where there's this CoO group in the back. That's how you know that these are acids, H in the front or CoO group in the back. All right, so here, try the CFU. I want you to circle the one of the substances that are acids. There's select all that apply because there's more than one. So anything that you think is an acid, pause the video now and circle it. Great, these are the answers. If you take a look, they all either have a hydrogen in the front or a CoO group in the back. The one exception, of course, is water, H2O. Even though it has hydrogens in the front, remember water is neutral. All right, so now let's talk about why acids conduct in aqueous solution. So why are they lit? Acids and ionic compounds conduct when dissolved in water because they are what's known as electrolytes. And electrolytes are substances that make ions in solution. When you hear the term electrolyte, you probably will think of something like sports drinks like Gatorade or Powerade or something like that. And that's because those drinks often contain or are said to contain electrolytes because they contain salts and minerals from ionic compounds. Now, the reason why that's important to have is because when you work out and you sweat a lot, you lose those electrolytes, you lose those salts during intense activity, and so Gatorade sort of helps replenish that. So we said electrolytes are things that produce ions in solution. So what does that have to do with them being good conductors? Because electrolytes produce ions in solution, they're able to complete an electric circuit and light a bulb. So here we have sort of a moving image of that. And you notice that the electrical charges are flowing through this circuit. If there were no ions here, then the charge wouldn't be able to flow completely through. The electrical particles will just stop, or the charged particles will just stop. But because there are ions here, it allows this flow of electrical current to continue. All right, so it's the fact that they have ions that allows the current to continue, and that's why they're good conductors, and that's why they're lit. Now, where exactly do those ions come from in an acid? So that may be your next question. So if we take an acid like you looked at in your lab last week, this is citric acid. When you dissolve it in water, so it starts off as a solid, S meaning solid, and if you dissolve it in water, it's going to break apart into the H plus ion, which comes in this case from the CoO group, and then the rest of it as an anion. So H plus is our cation, and then we have our anion here. So what exactly does that look like? So here was our unknown solid acid, D, from the lab. It's a solid. It started off as a solid. And this is sort of a particle diagram. It's really of an ionic compound, but it still represents the solid, so we'll use it here. So it starts off looking like this as a solid. And then we mixed it and dissolved it in water, okay? And then what happens once it was fully dissolved in water? It sort of breaks apart into those ions. So the magenta or pink circles represent H plus it breaks apart into, and then the green ones represent the anion. So these are the ions that are produced when you mix an acid in water. Similarly, an ionic compound will also produce a cation and an anion. And it's these ions that make the acids and ionic compounds conduct when in solution. So key thing to remember, when acids ionize, they break down into H plus cation and the rest of the molecule is an anion. All right, now try the CFU. Which of these covalent molecules will conduct an aqueous solution? Pause the video now. When you press play again, the answer will be revealed. Great. The answer is C and D. So remember, acids conduct in aqueous solution. Ionic compounds do as well, but none of these were ionic compounds. And acids, you can recognize them as from the chemical form as having an H in the front or a COOH group in the back. All right. The last thing we're going to talk about is what are the non-acids called? So this was a question that some people had. So you have acids, and what else do you have? So things that are not acids, they can be either neutral or bases. So an example of an acid would be something like vinegar. Example of something that's neutral would be something like water. An example of something that's a base would be ammonia. So essentially you see that you have three different types of things based on their acidity. It can be an acid like a vinegar, it can be neutral like water, or a base like ammonia. So how do we determine something as an acid or a base? It all has to do with what's called this pH scale, which typically goes from 1 to 14, but it can extend outside of that. And that's used to measure how acidic or basic something is. The lower the pH, the more H plus is in that solution. And a solution is something that you get when you dissolve a substance in water. So the lower the pH, the more H plus in that solution, the more acidic. The higher the pH, the less H plus in the solution, so the more basic. So the key thing to remember is that the lower the pH, the more acidic, and the higher the pH, the more basic. And neutral substances would have a pH of 7. So pH less than 7 is acidic, pH equal to 7 is neutral, pH greater than 7 is basic. All right, so try this CFU now. Which of these molecules has a pH less than 7? Select all that apply. Great, the answer is A and C. So remember, we can write these acids have a pH less than 7. And that would correspond to something that has a COOH group in the back, like choice A, or an H in the front, like choice C. Now, if you chose D, water, remember H2O is water, and although it has a hydrogen in the front, water is an exception because it's neutral. All right, so we've covered everything that we need to cover in this video about acids for now. So that's it. Have a quality day.